Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 30. Congratulations on making it to the last day of NaNoWriMo. My name is Lynn Johnston, and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. Let's talk about what makes a great resolution. The resolution of your story is extremely important. This is the parting note that you are leaving your reader with. This is the thing that is going to seriously impact your reader's decision on whether or not they're going to buy your next book or buy another one of your books. Readers do very heavily use how you end your story and how it makes them feel as a decision maker for whether or not they like your book and whether or not they want to read more of your stuff. So let's talk about what goes into making a great resolution. Unless you're writing something that is going to have ambiguity in the ending, literary fiction or maybe horror where you want to just leave a note up in the air as to whether or not the monster's really dead, or some other book where your story hinges on the reader having a little shock of not being sure. Most of the time, you want all the loose ends related to the book's main story question tied up. A lot of the time, unless you're writing a tragedy or a story where the characters live in a world where things are bitterly unfair, readers want to see characters justly rewarded and punished. And that doesn't necessarily mean in a very straightforward, heavy-handed sort of way. The rewards and punishments can be subtle. Poetic justice is often something you see in a really good resolution, where the villain, maybe they get off for the crime, but somehow where they end up at the end of the story turns out to be just exactly the right punishment they need, even if they don't go to jail or suffer the traditional punishments you would expect. So you can be creative with how your characters are rewarded and punished. Maybe your character doesn't get the girl at the end of the story, even though your readers expected him to or her to. But your main character needs to get something at the end of this that basically says, okay, this was worthwhile. This was a journey that was worth taking. And it can be a realization that is the character's reward. It can be a change of mind. Basically, maybe your character's reward is that they realized, oh my gosh, home was right in front of me this whole time, and all I had to do was click my heels together 3 times, and voila, I am magically where I want to be. I just didn't appreciate that home was such an awesome place, as in The Wizard of Oz. So you want to think about how not just your main characters get rewarded, because of course your protagonist and antagonist are rewarded by however the climax is resolved. Whatever happens at the end of that final showdown, that's a big part of their reward or punishment. But also, it's important to think about any main secondary characters that you have. If your protagonist has an ally, or if your antagonist has some henchmen or minions, you also want to think about how you can add some emotional satisfaction to the ending of your book by hinting at how those characters are justly rewarded or punished for what they did, their contributions to the main character's journey as the story unfolded. You also want to give the reader a hint as to what your characters' lives are going to be like in the future. You don't have to say, and they lived happily ever after, and they got married, and they had 5 kids, and their kids all grew up to be awesome people who went to college and got great grades. I mean, you don't have to go into great detail necessarily about painting that picture. And you can, like in a romance, they often do. Romances often end with like an epilogue 6 months later or 9 months later, or a year later, where the heroine is pregnant, or the heroine just had a baby, or the heroine has like a little toddler walking around, and you see that they're living happily ever after with their family. And that's a convention of the genre. But you can just do it if you can just hint through what the characters are thinking or what the characters are saying, You want to hint what their lives are going to be like from here on out. If they have gone through some sort of character growth, you want to hint that that change is permanent, and that whatever mindset alteration in their mindset they've experienced, that it's going to be with them for the rest of their lives. If they have decided that in some way they are going to change, like your protagonist swears, I'm never going to smoke again, or from here on out I'm going to be selfless instead of selfish, or whatever it is that their arc was, you want to hint that that's permanent. And you want to, if you can show through actions, that's really great. If maybe your character this whole time has just been debating, should I join the military or not? Should I join the military or not? And maybe at the end of the book, the way that you show that the character has made the change that he's been struggling with through the whole novel, maybe you show him joining the military. Or if it's a different change you're looking for, maybe you show him not joining the military. And that hints to the reader what his life is going to be like either way, however he makes that choice. So looking at what your character's thinking and saying and doing and the choices they make at the very end of the book, that's a way, those are all ways to convey to the reader, okay, this is how things are going to be from here on out. Now you effectively know the end of the story. In terms of emotional resonance, this one's kind of tricky, and it's often achieved in edits. It's very, very difficult when you're writing your first draft, unless you are hit by a bolt of inspiration, to get the emotional resonance of your resolution just right. And that's okay. Don't worry about it. Do the best you can, but realize that if you don't hit that emotional note just right, that's something you can fix later. But you do want to think about how you're going to leave your reader emotionally. Are you going to leave them looking at the last scene of your book going, "Aww"? Are they going to be like shocked and like, does your book end on some like massive, horrific surprise? Do you want your reader to read the last line of your book and laugh? Do you want your reader to like stand up and cheer after they read the last line of your book, or to feel like doing that? You basically want to think about what emotion you're going to end on. What kind of story you're telling tends to determine that. For example, it's really hard, a lot harder to get editors interested and agents interested in your romance if it doesn't somehow end on a romantic note. And the exception, of course, is series. And you want to think about that even if you're writing a series. How can you give the reader a good, positive emotional resonance while still leaving enough open for the next book? And often that's achieved by giving the characters a happy for now ending instead of a happily ever after ending. So you don't imply that the problem is permanently fixed, but you go like, whew, at least we've got a break now and there's hope for the future. And that's a way of giving the reader a sense that this story is complete and that the characters have reached a good spot and achieved something without saying, and by the way, we're done. So whether you're writing a series or standalone, you always want to think about where you're going to leave the reader, what emotional state you want them to be in when they put down your book after reading the very last sentence. So looking at your protagonist, if your protagonist survives the final climactic showdown that you wrote the last couple days, how is he or she rewarded for his efforts or her efforts? How does beating the antagonist or achieving that goal make your protagonist's life better? And also, often you want to show your protagonist having that experience of being rewarded, because your reader is going to experience that along with the protagonist. At this point, they've completely bonded, or they should have, with your protagonist. So what your protagonist feels, your reader is experiencing vicariously. So don't cheat your protagonist of that, like, woohoo, we got the reward, we did something right, we accomplished something, because if you deprive your protagonist of it, you're depriving your reader of it too. And of course, you could have a bittersweet ending to your climax. May have left the protagonist in a place where they're having a bittersweet resolution, and that's okay. Readers read for that too. There are people who love that kind of ending, but just be really clear on how you're rewarding your protagonist at the end. And if your protagonist doesn't survive, it's really important that you show how things are better for the people that your protagonist fought for during the climax. If you have a protagonist who completely sacrificed themselves, gave their lives so that the antagonist would be defeated or the goal was achieved, the resolution needs to show someone that the reader cares about being better off as a result. And that's how you get emotional resolution from a dead protagonist. Other characters in your story. How are the surviving characters on both sides affected by the outcome of the final showdown? Who's better off than before? Who's worse off than before? If your antagonist was like some sort of evil corporate raider and the finale was some sort of courtroom showdown where whatever corrupt thing your villain did is exposed, you kind of want to show afterwards that people are better off. They're not being taken advantage. Whoever he was taking advantage of, they're not taken advantage of anymore. Whoever's worse off, if he had partners who were helping him, you want to see that they're being indicted too, or they're going to jail with him, or whatever. Whatever is appropriate for your story, you want to make sure you hint at, and it doesn't have to be big. It can be like a line of dialogue between the protagonist and the contagonist that lets you know what the minor characters, what happened to them. You don't have to show it directly. You can. It kind of just depends on your story and how important those secondary characters were to the reader. And again, remember, sometimes your reader bonds more strongly with a secondary character, especially if they had a significant role to play in the story in helping your protagonist. For those readers who bonded more strongly with your secondary characters than your protagonist because, for whatever reason, because they're more similar in personality, or they remind the reader of someone that they really like, whatever. It's really important, if you think your reader's going to be bonding with those secondary characters, then you do want to show how they're better off or worse off, and how they're rewarded and punished at the end of the story. So you want to see how you can squeeze that in, and how much time you want to spend during your resolution on that is going to depend on how big a role those characters played in the story. Looking at the conflict of your book, this is, now if you've been paying attention through this whole video series, every day I've been telling you have to have conflict, you need big conflict, you need more conflict. This is the one part of your book that doesn't have to have conflict. It can be warm and fuzzy, everybody can be getting along, but because it doesn't contain a lot of conflict, it needs to be short. As short as you can make it and still show how your story's events change the world that you're writing in a satisfying way. So the longer you go on with the warm, fuzzy, zero conflict scenes, the more likely the reader is to get bored. The more you can show that quickly and intensely, the more emotional oomph your resolution is going to have. So you want to think about that. It's like you want to show what's crucial, but you don't want to just like have pages and pages of your hero and heroine watching their kids play and talking about what they're going to do when they get old. That's something that could be a couple paragraphs. And also you want to think about, again, what emotion are you ending your story on? Depending on how many main characters you had, whether you had multiple protagonists, whether you had significant secondary characters, you don't necessarily have to end the story on your protagonist. A lot of people do. It's very common for the last scene to be in the protagonist's point of view, but it doesn't have to be. If the emotion you want to give your reader at the end of the story is best conveyed through showing what happened to your antagonist, if you want to end on like, haha, that guy really got what he deserved, poetic justice is right there, you could end with your antagonist being punished. Maybe the romance in your story was something that wasn't happening with your protagonist. Maybe it was happening with one of your secondary characters or a couple of them. And you want to end on that romantic note. Maybe you don't end with your protagonist. Maybe the last scene is those two secondary characters after they say goodbye to the protagonist, kind of running off into the sunset together holding hands. So don't feel like you have to be constrained by convention. The most emotionally powerful ending you can come up with your story is the best one, regardless of whether or not it fits the conventions of your genre. And of course, breaking genre conventions can be difficult. and it's difficult to do it well, and it also can make people feel like, oh, this doesn't feel right because it's a certain genre and I have certain expectations. But if you do it really, really, really well and you give people that satisfying emotional experience, you can pull it off. So looking at your setting, do the protagonist and any of his or her allies go back to where they started? Or do they settle in the new place that they've come to? Are they finally able to go somewhere that they've only been dreaming about being? Like, for example, at Blade Runner, the protagonist and the android, cyborg, whatever he's fallen in love with, they actually go off someplace where they think that they can live unpersecuted. They don't stay where they are, and they don't stay in any of the places that they go to during the story. A lot of times, if you're ending a romance, like the hero and heroine, they buy a home, or she moves in with him, or he moves in with her. So one of them, they're basically going to end up in a meaningful place, moving into someone else's house or moving in with someone together. That's a profoundly meaningful decision to make. So you want to think about, what does the last setting in your story, or last settings, if you've got like multiple characters that you're talking about in your resolution, where are you going to show them ending up, and how can you use that setting that you show them in last to hint at how the rest of their life is going to be? Are you showing your protagonist at the new job that she basically won by beating out everybody else or exposing one of her competitors during a job search? Was that the climax of your story? Then showing her at the first day of her job might be the way you want to go. That's going to be an extremely meaningful scene when she sits down at her beautiful new desk. And the receptionist comes in and says, "Hey, I'm your assistant. Is there anything I can do for you?" That setting serves as a validation of her journey, and it serves as a basically part of her reward. So think about how you can use your setting like that to intensify the rewards and punishments and the emotional impact of your resolution. If you show your heroine going into a hospital to give birth, that's going to be a meaningful setting for her and for the hero, and it's going to be an interesting resolution to your romance, especially if the whole subplot was about her getting pregnant, or not being able to, or needing fertility treatments, or whatever it is she was trying to do that resulted in her getting pregnant. And if that's the resolution you've chosen for her, use your setting to make that as meaningful as possible and to give the reader the most bang for their buck. Also, you can think about how setting symbolizes theme. Looking at the theme of your story, if your theme is all about being confined versus being free, and your protagonist's goal throughout the entire story was to find a way to get free, if you've shown your protagonist in confining spaces and inside buildings, and basically shown them being confined throughout the whole story, if you set the last scene of your book in an open field or in a big park where there's a lot of space around there, you've basically, on a subconscious level, you're using your setting to tell the reader, basically give them an image of freedom that helps reinforce your theme. So think about how the location of your characters in the last scene of the book can relate to the theme of your story. So looking at your story promise, this is the last chance you have to keep all the promises you made to the reader. And you may or may not have fulfilled all those promises as you've been going through. We've been talking about it every day. So it's possible that by the time you get to the resolution, those promises are already fulfilled, and all you really have to do is hint at what's going to happen next. But if there are any unresolved subplots or any secondary plot lines that haven't been resolved yet, unless you are planning a series, and you specifically are intending to leave those open, you want to think about how the resolution scenes with those characters can either tie up those loose ends or hint that they are going to be tied up in the future. And that's the other thing to remember about your resolution. You don't have to show everything being completed. You just have to show the reader a picture that says, hey, we're on track for completing those, and they are going to get completed off screen after the novel's over. You don't have to worry about these characters screwing this up. They're going to get where we said they're going to go. So later on, when you are editing your novel, you can make a note of each promise that you made to the reader as you go. There may be some promises that you unconsciously introduced into the story that you weren't consciously keeping track of. And just notice when you're reading, do those promises get fulfilled or not? Do we find out that the hero had a terrible relationship with his mom and we never find out why that happened? Maybe that's not important to your story. Maybe your reader won't care, but you need to think about it because it's a question you raised that you didn't answer. And if you leave too many questions unanswered, the end of the story can feel unsatisfying, even if your protagonist is successful in what they're trying to do. So getting started today, do your pre-writing ritual, do your pre-writing exercise. By now you should have a pretty good idea, or at least have a pretty good feel for what kinds of rituals are working for you and what kinds of exercises are working for you. And I want to encourage you, for 30 days, you've basically been training yourself to write every day. I want to encourage you to keep this up because that writing habit of writing a little bit every day doesn't have to be 1,667 words. You can just write 100 words a day. But having that discipline and having that habit keeps your creative juices flowing. Your muse knows that you're always working, that every day, the more you work, the more ideas your muse sends to you. So basically sitting down to write every day, even if you don't have something specific you need to write, even if you're between stories, is basically a way of signaling to your muse and to your subconscious, depending on whether you think a muse is real or you think it's a manifestation of your subconscious. You're basically communicating to that creative force in your life, hey, I am ready to work, go ahead and send me ideas. And the other thing is, a lot of times working gets you in the mode of generating ideas. It's easy to say, oh, I don't have any ideas today, so I'm not going to write. But sometimes just the act of sitting down and writing something very mundane, journaling, doing an exercise, a lot of times that gets the juices flowing so that the ideas start coming. But if you don't take that 10 or 15 minutes to get started and get into a creative mindset, you never get the idea. And that's one of the ways that people end up being blocked for months, is because they don't do the minimal amount of work necessary when they're not inspired to get them into a state of mind where they can be inspired. So I know that this has been a big push, and the idea of writing this much every day, probably exhausting. But please take away from this the idea that you could have a writing habit where you write a little bit every day. And maybe some days you write more than others. Maybe some days you only give yourself 10 minutes because you're busy, and other days you give yourself an hour because you have it. But this writing habit that you've started is incredibly valuable. Please keep it up. I also want to say that sometimes the last scene in your story is the hardest to write because you don't want the story to be over. And I've definitely felt that. I've had stories where I was like, what else could they do? I like these characters too much. So here's the thing. You can always write another novel about these characters. Give your characters what they deserve today, and you make your readers happy. Don't try and throw the whole kitchen sink into your resolution. Try and make it as short as you can while still conveying all the emotion that you need your reader to feel as your story wraps up. And of course, it's always easier to write longer and cut. So if you're not sure if you're giving the reader enough to spark the emotions you want, write longer and edit later. But anyway, if you're having trouble with your ending, that's not uncommon. And also giving people a sense of resolution. Sometimes you feel the resolution when you're imagining the story that's hard to put on the page. And I just want to say again, you can do that in edits. If you just cannot come up with the perfect last line, if your novel does not have its, I think this is the start of a beautiful friendship line, that's okay. do the best you can, come up with the best ending that you can, and you're going to want to rethink it in edits anyway, because as you change your story in edits, you are probably going to have opportunities to think of even cooler endings than you are thinking of right now, because the story will become cooler as you edit it. After you write the end on your manuscript, I want to say congratulations. You've done something that so many people say they want to do and they never even start. Not only did you start, you finished. And that's amazing. It is time for you to celebrate. Whatever you do, a small celebration, a big celebration, give yourself some kudos. Take a few moments to just bask in the warmth of having done something that you said you were going to do and made it all the way to the end. It was a huge effort to write 50,000 words in 30 days. And I just want to say I'm very proud of you for doing that. So now what? Now you've finished a novel. It's 50,000 words. It's probably not perfect. There's probably stuff in it that already you think you would change. I want to recommend that you give yourself a little bit of a break before you start editing, though. At least give yourself 2 weeks away from the story. More if you can manage it. If you just can't wait to start digging in, go ahead and dig in. But sometimes having a little bit of time away from the story, especially one where you have spent a little time with another story, whether it's brainstorming or just reading a good book by an author you love, detaching a little bit from your characters and your ideas before you start editing is really valuable. It gives you a little bit of emotional distance in 2 ways. First, it lets you disconnect just a little from your characters so that you can be a little more objective about how they're coming across on the page. And second, it gives you a little bit of distance from the actual words that you wrote. You've invested your soul into the story. You've invested a huge amount of time and energy in your story and in writing it a certain way. And you are going to read the words that you've written this month later on, and you're going to feel a sense of dismay when you read some of them, because they are not going to be as good as you remembered. They are not going to exactly convey the awesomeness and wonderfulness of the story that you envisioned in your head. That's really normal. That doesn't mean you wrote a terrible novel. It means you wrote the first draft of a novel. First drafts are always flawed. It's impossible to both write the draft of a story and get it perfect at the same time. And that's why you write first and then you edit. So if you have had a little bit of distance and broken that emotional connection and a little bit to the words that you have written, it's a little less dismaying when you go back and read it and realize that it's not as perfect as you'd like it to be. It takes the sting out of realizing, oh, I've got some work to do here. So, if you have never edited a novel before, or if you find editing difficult, or you're just overwhelmed because you do not have any sort of structured process or strategy for approaching edits, I just want to recommend that you go to this URL. I've put up a free ebook, Editing for Story. It basically just talks about the process that I have developed for myself over the last 15 years for editing novels. When I first started editing, and you'll read a little story in this book about my very first experience editing a novel. It was terrible, by the way. Not only was my very first novel terrible, my experiencing of editing it was even worse. I just got completely overwhelmed. I thought I was going to just read through it once with a colored pen and mark up some things. I thought I'd fix some grammar and, maybe rewrite a few lines of dialogue. And I thought it would take me, maybe 3 or 4 days to edit. And voila, I would have an awesome novel. And some of you who have been writing for a while are laughing right now because you know what a ridiculous expectation that was, taking a first draft and expecting to fix a few words here and there and have it be done. That just isn't realistic. When you are writing a story for the first time, that first draft, you're focusing so hard on imagining the world and figuring out what the characters are supposed to be doing and trying to fill in the plot holes and figure out how your characters get from point A to point B and convey all this emotion that you're experiencing, because when you're imagining the story, you're feeling it along with your characters, but getting that down on the page is very difficult. And honestly, I don't know a single writer who just writes a rough draft and is happy with it. I don't know a single writer who writes a rough draft and just sends it off to their agent or editor. Anybody who is doing this and trying to get professionally published, we rewrite. And we rewrite intensively sometimes. And also we try not to get down on ourselves for the fact that the first draft is just a struggle to get the basic skeleton of the story down. It's okay for it to be flawed. There's going to be holes in it. There's going to be things you didn't think of. There's going to be ideas that you came up with in the middle of the book that totally changed the story. And you included them because they were awesome. But those new ideas throw the first half of the book out of balance. And now you have to go back and fix the first half of the book. So I just want to say, if you are struggling with editing, if you are looking at it as an overwhelming process, or you don't know where to start, or you're not even sure how to find plot holes, you're not sure how to tell if your story has a good structure, this book is free. I put it up here. Anybody can download it. All you have to do is put in your email address, and it'll open up to a PDF that will take you through the very simple structure. The very simple structured edit that I go through. I edit in stages. I start by looking at structure, making sure that major plot points are in a good place, that I haven't totally missed an important plot point. And there's a very simple way to map that out, and I explain that in the book. I also, after I've made sure that my major plot points are in place based on whatever story structure I chose, then I go through and I do a secondary edit where I look at every scene and how it stands on its own, trying to just make sure every scene in the novel is as strong as it can possibly be, that it moves the story forward, that it has a purpose, that it has the right kind of conflict, that it has enough conflict. And in this book, Editing for Story, I've basically included 17 questions. Every scene in my novel, when I get to that stage where I'm looking at the scenes, I ask myself those 17 questions about every single scene. And the answers to those questions tell me what I need to fix in my story to make the story strong. And I do these two steps, editing for story, looking at plot structure and looking at the strength of my scenes before I polish anything. And the reason for that is that you can basically take a bad story and spend 6 months fixing the wording and still have a bad story. You don't want to waste time doing that. You want to get the story right first, and then you fix the wording. So anyway, I would strongly encourage you, even if you're an experienced writer, having that kind of structure editing process, if you don't have it already, if you haven't got a system for yourself, the book is free. Go check it out. See if maybe something in it can help you. And I want to wish you the absolute best in editing your novel. I know, like everyone that I edit, it looks like a mountain that I have to climb at the very beginning. Once you get into the edits, especially if you have a checklist and you know you're looking for all the things you need to look for, it becomes less like climbing a mountain and more like going on a hike. Especially breaking it down into steps, so that instead of trying to hold your whole story in your head, you're just looking at one thing at a time. And also, I want to encourage you to check out Editing for Emotion. I'm very excited. This is a class I've been teaching for a couple of years. I've only taught it to a very small groups of people over the last couple of years as time has permitted. Editing for Emotion is a system that I developed for myself over the last 15 years as a result of studying other people's fiction and trying to find out why their stories had such a deep emotional impact on me, and the stories I was writing did not have the emotional impact that I wanted. And there's a lot of stuff in this, and if you want to go to the website and check it out, there's a complete description of it. I'm very excited. I finally figured out how I can share it as a self-study course, so you don't have to wait for me to offer to teach it again. In this course, I talk about things like why description tends to be boring and how you can fix that in your own writing, how to turn telling into showing without having to be inspired. I have a step-by-step method for taking telling, a sentence of telling or several sentences of telling, and kind of unfolding what they contain and turning that into showing. I've got some discussions of how you handle narrative summary and dramatic summary so that they're more interesting to the reader. How to handle exposition. I've got like 6 or 7 techniques on how to handle exposition so that it doesn't stop the story and it's interesting to the reader. And there's a whole lot more. So I invite you to check it out. I hope that you find it interesting. If you're having any sort of trouble with your story where people are saying the plot is good, but your characters' personalities really aren't coming through on the page, or the scene feels really rushed, it feels like you're doing too much telling, not enough showing, you're not digging deep enough into point of view. These are the kind of problems I was trying to solve, and that I did solve with this editing system for myself, and I'd love to share it with you. Thanks for hanging out with me for the last 30 days. I am, for the next week, going to be giving editing tips for those of you who are wanting to kind of prepare to edit your NaNoWriMo novel. Again, I hope you're going to take a little time off first, give yourself a little break. But of course, we all have the Christmas holidays, and that's a great time to get started on editing. So please stop by. We'll be talking about some of the things you need to think about when you're editing your novel. Some tricks for how you look at your novel and identify specific problems and how to solve them. Over the next week, I'll be doing this series of videos at writesmarternotharder.com, and I invite you to come back, tell your friends. I hope you had a wonderful November and a fantastic NaNoWriMo experience. Once again, I just want to say congratulations on making it through 30 days of NaNoWriMo. You rock.